Welcome, dear friends, to Moonlight Audiobook. I am Brandon, your host for today's mystery. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'm so glad you've joined me. This is a tale where nothing is as it seems, where every whispered lie leads us closer to a chilling truth, and only one man, with his impeccable moustache and unshakable logic, can piece it all together. I invite you into the shadowed halls of Chateau Ravel for Hercule Poirot, Murder on the Glass Balcony. Let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Deception. It was the sort of gathering that filled the society pages and emptied the wine cellars of the Riviera. The Château de Vert, an opulent cliffside estate perched high above the glittering French coast, was hosting a weekend affair for a peculiar circle of the rich and restless. Beneath its sleek glass balconies and Art Deco arches, the air shimmered with wealth, secrecy, and the faint scent of betrayal. The occasion? A private viewing of The Dying Swan, a newly restored ballet costume worn by Anna Pavlova, now in the possession of the formidable Contessa Armandine Duprez, a widow whose social standing was as polished as the marble floors of her estate. But the real draw, whispered among guests like a forbidden phrase, was not the artifact, but the company, an international group of individuals, each more intriguing, and more privately reviled, than the last. At precisely 6 o'clock on Friday evening, the first champagne flutes clinked. The sea reflected a bruised gold, and the breeze carried the murmurs of a gathering that already felt like a play with too many villains and no clear hero. Among the guests, Sir Hugo Vassal, a British arms magnate with a suspiciously pristine conscience and a wife half his age. Celeste Armandine, the Contessa's glamorous, tight-lipped niece and heir, a former dancer who abandoned the stage under uncertain circumstances. Dr. Leo Martin, a Swiss psychiatrist with an obsession for the criminal mind, and, as many suspected, a flair for manipulation. Dominic Vale, a burnt-out playwright whose once-celebrated tragedies now struggled for applause in Paris cafes. Lucille Vale, his younger sister, charming and sly, whose loyalty to her brother veered toward the destructive. Inspector Gerard, a local police official who was uninvited but tolerated, clinging to Contessa Duprez's influence like a barnacle to the hull of a yacht. By nightfall, the chateau was alive with calculated conversation. Diamonds glittered. Secrets, however, glowed even brighter, hidden behind every brittle toast and sideways glance. It happened just before midnight. The guests had drifted into the drawing room for a final nightcap. Music spilled lazily from a phonograph, while the glass balcony above, a private overlook accessed only through the Contessa's suite, reflected the moonlight like a blade. Then came the scream. A sharp, feminine cry cleaved the air. Moments later, the body of Dominic Vale lay sprawled grotesquely on the stone tiles below the glass balcony. One arm twisted beneath him, his skull cracked open like a porcelain mask. A wineglass, unbroken, sat precariously beside him, its rim smeared crimson not with blood, but lipstick. No one had seen him fall. No one admitted to being near the Contessa's balcony. And no one believed it was an accident. The news traveled with uncanny speed. Within hours, telegrams were sent and wires crossed. A name was spoken with reverence and urgency, as though it alone could untangle the web tightening around the Château de Vert. By Saturday afternoon, Hercule Poirot arrived. He did not burst upon the scene, as lesser men might. He stepped from the motorcar with precision, his patent leather shoes gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. A Panama hat shaded his eyes, and his moustache, resplendent and deliberate, announced him as clearly as any calling card. He paused on the threshold, taking in the estate's symmetry. He did not ask for introductions or explanations. He merely surveyed the high terrace, the glass balcony, and the cold expression of Inspector Gerard waiting to greet him. "A man has died," Poirot said simply, "and already I feel the disturbance in the order of things." Inspector Gerard cleared his throat. "It appears to have been an accident. The balcony rail is glass, almost invisible at night. He may have fallen. Poirot gave him a look that suggested deep pity. And yet, he said softly, you do not believe that. Gerard hesitated. No. No, I don't. Poirot nodded. Bon. Then let us begin not with what is seen, but with what is hidden. The household was placed on strict instruction. No one was to leave the estate. It was a simple rule, imposed politely, and obeyed with the unease of those who know they are trapped in a play they cannot rewrite. Poirot, as was his habit, asked for silence before interviews. He spent the next hour alone in the drawing-room, standing before the fireplace, measuring its symmetry, aligning the objects on the mantel with barely perceptible adjustments. When summoned for dinner, he declined, requesting only black coffee and a quiet room. By evening, the storm had truly arrived, not from the sea, but within the minds of the guests. Eyes darted. Allegiances shifted. No one trusted anyone, and Poirot hadn't yet asked a single question aloud. That night, as the wind scratched at the windows and thunder echoed beyond the cliffs, Poirot stood alone beneath the glass balcony. He traced the tiles with a gloved hand. Then he looked up, not at the stars, but at the structure itself and the faint scuff on its edge. Mon Dieu, he whispered, so early, and already they lie. Chapter 2. A Gallery of Faces. The Château de Verre was unusually still that morning, the kind of quiet that followed a storm of sensation, neither natural nor weather-born, but human. Its guests, each carefully chosen for their prestige, influence, or ability to entertain, had awakened beneath a new shadow. Dominic Vale was dead, and the cause, though still unspoken aloud, echoed unmistakably through the corridors, murder. Poirot moved through the estate with deliberate pace, his polished shoes silent upon the tessellated floors, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. The symmetry of the place pleased him, though he found the aesthetic precision at odds with the disorder of its inhabitants. There was elegance here, yes, but no harmony. By mid-morning, he had requested each guest remain available for questioning. Not in the manner of the police, brusque and authoritative, but with the soft certainty of someone who knew the truth would come, quietly, inevitably, and most likely by its own hand. The guests were gathered in the drawing-room, 8 in total now, including the hostess. Their postures, expressions, and choice of seating betrayed more than any words might. Poirot, a master not of deduction alone but of performance, allowed silence to linger as he observed them, watching not for guilt, but for theatre. For guilt, he well knew, was an actor easily replaced by grief, boredom, or feigned confusion. The Contessa Armandine Duprez, always the centerpiece of her own events, had assumed a regal pose by the grand piano, her expression composed, her attention elsewhere, as though tragedy was simply a scheduling inconvenience. Her niece, Celeste, sat by the tall windows, pale and unreadable, a porcelain figure carved from restraint and private resentments. Poirot noted how she avoided the gaze of the others, particularly Sir Hugo Vassal, whose position near the fireplace was both too casual and too contrived. He had positioned himself like a man unbothered, but Poirot saw the tremor in the way he stirred his coffee. Beside him, Lucille Vale, Dominic's sister, clutched a lace handkerchief with theatrical despair, glancing often at the doorway as though expecting someone who would never arrive. Dr. Leo Martin stood alone, studying the titles on a bookshelf he clearly did not intend to read. Poirot made particular note of him, not for what he displayed, but for what he masked. There was something in the stillness of the man, something too controlled. He observed not like a guest but like a scientist peering into a cage. Poirot's first inquiries were gentle, his tone deferential. He asked of routines, of relationships, of trivial movements during the evening prior. He requested nothing sensational and listened less to the answers than to the manner of their delivery. The Contessa claimed to have retired early, her rooms on the upper floor far from the revelry. She admitted no sound, No disturbance, only the scream that broke the silence like glass. Poirot found her poise suspicious, though not necessarily dishonest. It was the poise of someone used to controlling a narrative. Celeste's story was colder, more clinical. She described Dominic as a guest of convenience, a fading friend whose presence was more a courtesy than a desire. Poirot caught the hesitation when she recounted the final hours before his death. There had been an argument, she admitted, but trivial. She had gone to bed soon after, alone. She said it without shame, but Poirot noted the deliberate tone. She was shielding something, perhaps not a crime, but certainly a truth. Sir Hugo Vassal was more irritated than grieved. He described the victim as a man of questionable temperament and dismissed the suggestion that they had quarreled. Yet he, too, bore the signs of evasion. He flinched at a question about the glass balcony, too quickly, too sharply. Poirot made no remark, only a mental note. Lucille Vale, on the other hand, proved difficult to pin. Her sorrow was real, of that Poirot was sure, but it danced dangerously with performance. She cried too readily and remembered too precisely. Her brother, she said, had many enemies, most of them made for the sake of inspiration. He liked to provoke, she confessed. Poirot, hearing this, understood. A man like Dominic Vale, a provocateur by design, was often more dangerous to the living than the dead. Dr. Martin's statement was the most polished. He had retired early, he said, but not to sleep, rather to study notes he had brought on criminal pathology. A coincidence, he added, in poor taste. Poirot doubted nothing in his words, but disliked them all the same. The man was too neutral, too detached. Poirot distrusted anyone who described murder as though it were an abstract. The remaining guests, a young couple from Nice and an Italian art dealer, offered little of interest. They had spoken briefly with Dominic during dinner, then left the conversation early, citing fatigue. Their timelines aligned, but Poirot marked them as irrelevant. Not because they could not lie, but because their lies would be clumsy, unambitious. This murder had not been committed by an amateur. By late afternoon, the mood at the estate had grown sour with tension. Every guest suspected the others, and all felt the weight of Poirot's calm authority. He asked few questions, but they sensed, correctly, that he missed nothing. He returned to the site of the crime in the evening light. The glass balcony still shimmered innocently above, its edge now cordoned by temporary rail. Poirot knelt beside the place where Dominic had landed, his eyes tracing the arc of the fall. There were no signs of struggle, no blood spatter on the rail, no scuffs or dragged footprints on the floor above. Yet he had seen something that troubled him. Not what was present, but what was absent. He requested to examine the Countess's suite and was escorted upstairs. The glass balcony's access point, a pair of French doors, remained locked. She claimed to have the only key. Poirot asked for it and was shown a heavy brass item resting in her jewelry drawer. The lock accepted it without hesitation. Still, he was unconvinced. There was something else, something out of place not in the room, but in the timeline. Poirot stood on the balcony, gazing down at the terrace below, and considered what he had learned. Dominic had fallen, yes, but not simply fallen. He had brought a wineglass with him. A glass that had landed perfectly upright, unsmashed, beside his head. Such an accident defied probability. A man who plunges to his death does not cradle stemware. Unless he did not fall by chance, but was placed. Or worse, watched as he fell. Poirot felt the first tremor of certainty. The pattern was beginning to emerge. Someone among them had orchestrated the scene with theatrical precision. Chapter 3: The Little Lies. Morning broke across the Château de Vere in threads of mist and color, casting the coastal cliffs in pale gold. From a distance, the estate looked untouched by death, serene, palatial, and indifferent. But inside, the atmosphere had grown brittle. The guests moved with forced civility, their eyes searching each other for signs of guilt. Conversation turned brittle and avoidant. No one spoke of the body, of the scream, or of the broken piece that now lingered in every corridor. Poirot began his day early, alone in the winter garden at the eastern wing of the estate. The plants, lush and well-tended, stood in perfect rows, their arrangement soothing to his sensibilities. Here, among the orderly foliage and trickling fountains, he allowed his thoughts to settle. A mystery, like a garden, could not be solved with haste. Each piece must be examined, each inconsistency nurtured until it revealed its true nature. And there were already inconsistencies, tiny things, like misaligned tiles in an otherwise perfect mosaic. The wineglass beside Dominique Vale's body, for one. The key to the Contessa's balcony, for another. Locked doors, convenient stories, the brittle performance of grief. Poirot had not yet accused, but he had begun to doubt. He asked to speak to each guest again. This time, he would not inquire broadly. He would press, gently but firmly, into the details they had hoped would go unnoticed. Sir Hugo Vassal was the first to return. His expression was one of controlled irritation, the bearing of a man used to commanding rooms, not answering to others. Poirot noted the subtle crease in his brow when asked about the final hour before the fall. Vassal claimed he had retired to his room to write letters. Poirot asked where the letters were. Vassal hesitated before admitting that none had been posted, they had been discarded. It was a clumsy response from a man so precise in reputation. Poirot let it pass, for now. He then mentioned a quiet observation from the footman, that Vassal had not returned to his room until nearly 1 in the morning. A small point, easily denied, but the industrialist's confidence faltered for just a moment. Poirot saw it, filed it away, and moved on. Celeste Armandine came next. Her poise had cooled overnight, becoming brittle at the edges. She spoke less than before, offering clipped answers, careful restraint. Poirot asked not about Dominique, but about her movements. She had, she said, gone to bed early. No, she had not heard anything prior to the scream. No, she had not seen Dominique after the performance ended. Poirot, however, had already learned otherwise. One of the maids, young, sharp-eyed, and forgettable to the guests, had reported seeing Celeste near the Contessa's stairwell shortly after 11. She had been alone, glancing back over her shoulder as she descended, her face pale. Poirot did not confront her with the contradiction. Not yet. But her lie was now marked. Lucille Vale returned next, visibly exhausted. Her grief, real as it may have been, now took the form of irritation. She resented the questioning, and more so, resented the implication. Poirot watched her hands carefully as she spoke. They moved too often, touching her scarf, her sleeve, her necklace, habits of a nervous mind. She claimed not to know who her brother had argued with that evening, though Poirot had already learned from the house staff that a heated exchange had taken place in the drawing room shortly before midnight. The voices had been loud. One male, one female. Poirot believed Lucille knew who the woman was. He also believed she was choosing silence, for now. Then came Dr. Martin. The psychiatrist was as controlled as ever, but Poirot observed something new in his bearing, a quiet curiosity. Not fear, not guilt, but the focused attention of a man watching the construction of a puzzle he desperately wished to solve before anyone else. Martin repeated his alibi. He had returned to his room early to work. No one had seen him after dinner. He had spoken with Dominique briefly, yes, but only earlier in the afternoon. They had discussed, rather obliquely, the psychology of secrecy. Poirot asked him what he had made of Dominique's mental state. The answer was prompt, unstable, theatrical, and possibly self-destructive. It was too clinical, too impersonal. Poirot did not believe for a moment that Martin had left it at that. The final guest to return was the Contessa. She entered the library as though attending a private recital, elegant, composed, immaculate in posture and perfume. She did not sit until invited. Poirot offered her no formal questions at first, only small observations: the excellent condition of the balcony doors, the undisturbed layer of dust on the outer sill, the manner in which the key had remained in her possession. Then he mentioned the mechanism of the lock, a traditional brass cylinder, easily copied by someone with opportunity. The Contessa did not flinch. She smiled thinly, as if amused by his implication. Poirot noted how she had sidestepped every substantive detail in their prior conversation. She had placed herself entirely outside the timeline. Too far outside. As if deliberately erasing her proximity to the event. A clever maneuver, but not a foolproof one. He ended the session early. That afternoon, Poirot returned once more to the scene of the crime, and this time, he brought a yardstick. He knelt again beneath the balcony and measured the pattern of the broken tiles. He measured the angle of the fall, the likely trajectory from a standing body pushed or thrown. The results disturbed him. Dominique Vale had not tumbled forward. His body had landed in a near-vertical position, the mark on his head clean and centralized. Such a fall required either precision or manipulation after death. Poirot's eyes moved to the balcony above. He imagined a man placed upon the edge, dazed or unconscious, then tipped just so. But who could have done it, and how? He returned inside and requested one final thing from the housekeeper, a list of who possessed keys to the wine cellar, the linen cupboard, and, curiously, the prop room beneath the ballroom stage. She provided the names without hesitation. One stood out. Not because it was expected, but because it had never been mentioned. Later that evening, Poirot sat alone in his quarters, writing in a leather-bound notebook. His notes were sparse but meticulous. Already, the pattern was sharpening. Several had lied. At least one had been on the glass balcony that night. And someone very clever, had gone to great lengths to manipulate appearances. But what intrigued him most was not the murder itself, but the psychology behind it. The wineglass, left so deliberately by the body, was not a mistake. It was a message. Chapter 4, Lies in Silk and Cognac. Poirot now believed he knew who the message was meant for. By the fourth day, the illusion of leisure had crumbled entirely. The Château de Vaux had become a gilded cage, its glittering views and manicured grounds reduced to the backdrop of a slow, tightening noose. The guests no longer spoke with civility. Meals were shorter, words fewer. Each person moved through the corridors with the silent suspicion of a chess piece waiting to be taken. The social fabric, once woven from grace and indulgence, had frayed into threads of fear and speculation. The police, reluctant at first to intervene in the affairs of the elite, had now grown emboldened by the presence of Hercule Poirot. It was as though his reputation lent their suspicions legitimacy. Inspector Gerard, never far from the scent of social advantage, had begun to act with theatrical confidence. And confidence, Poirot observed, was dangerous when married to haste. That morning, Gerard requested a private audience with Poirot in the East Library, a cold room filled with unread volumes and polished mahogany. He began not with courtesy, but with declaration. They had a suspect, he said. A clear one. Celeste Armandine. She had no solid alibi. A maid had seen her descending from the direction of the Contessa's suite at a suspicious hour. She had admitted to an argument with the deceased, downplayed, of course, but undeniable. And most damning of all, a search of her dressing table had yielded a duplicate brass key, identical to the one used for the Contessa's balcony doors. Poirot listened with polite detachment. He did not interrupt. Only once the inspector had finished did he offer a brief nod and a gentle question. And what, he asked, did Gerard believe to be her motive? The inspector's reply was vague, something about a past affair, a personal betrayal. He spoke of passion, of wounded pride, of feminine impulsiveness. Poirot said nothing for a long while. Then he turned to the window and regarded the distant line of the sea. At last, he spoke. There were 3 things, he said, that troubled him deeply. First, the presence of the wineglass, still upright beside the body. A man in fear, cornered or pushed to his death, does not pause to collect his drink. Nor does he carry it onto a balcony unless he has reason to believe he will return. Second, the locked doors. Celeste, it seemed, had a key, but why conceal it in her dressing table? A key hidden in one's room is not a murder weapon, it is a planted breadcrumb. A trail meant to be followed. And third, Celeste's demeanor. She had been cautious, yes. Guarded, even. But she had not been defensive. She had not, in Poirot's experience, behaved like a woman haunted by the act of murder. She had lied, but not in the desperate way the guilty lie. Her lie had been crafted for protection, not concealment of blood. Gerard disagreed, of course. The case, he believed, was building itself. Poirot did not argue. He merely asked that no arrests be made, not yet. The inspector grumbled, but complied. That afternoon, Poirot requested a walk through the estate's west garden with the head gardener, a quiet man named Roux who had tended the grounds since the Contessa's youth. They strolled among the sculpted hedges and lavender beds, speaking little until Poirot asked, casually, if any of the guests had made unusual requests prior to the murder. Roux thought for a moment. Only one, he said. Dr. Martin had asked to see the layout of the old performance stage beneath the ballroom. The prop room, in particular. He had claimed an interest in architectural history. Poirot did not respond aloud, but his pace slowed. He had begun to notice something strange. The performance stage had not been used in over a year, yet someone had been inside recently. Dust patterns disrupted. A chair moved slightly off-center. A rope coil unlooped on the floor. It meant nothing by itself. But in Poirot's experience, nothing was ever just itself. By early evening, the tension inside the chateau had congealed. The guests were growing restless. Suspicion now moved from whisper to open accusation. Sir Hugo Vassal had taken to pacing the halls, speaking sharply to staff. Lucille Vale had retreated into her brother's former room, emerging only for meals, where she stared fixedly at Celeste. The Contessa herself appeared unbothered, perhaps deliberately so, offering wine to the guests with an almost theatrical serenity. Poirot requested one final conversation with Celeste. This time not to question, but to observe. She arrived in the study with shoulders drawn back and her expression unreadable. Poirot guided her gently through a series of innocuous questions, about her childhood, her ballet training, her relationship with the Contessa. And then, without warning, he asked about the key. Her eyes narrowed, but she did not protest. She had not known it was missing, she said. It had been placed there after Dominic's death. Poirot watched her closely. Her heartbeat had quickened, he could see it in the rise of her collarbone. But her voice had not faltered. A frightened woman, yes. But not a deceitful one. He believed her. Someone had planted the key. And in doing so, had revealed not just a desire to mislead, but a deep understanding of how suspicion blooms. It was a manipulation designed not to eliminate a witness, but to frame one. Whoever had done it knew human behavior intimately, knew how fear distorts memory, how guilt transfers itself to the nearest convenient vessel. That night, Poirot wrote again in his notebook. His list of suspects remained unchanged, but beside one name he drew a small red circle. It was not Celeste. The next morning brought a twist Poirot had expected. Inspector Gerard, without waiting for approval, declared Celeste Armandine formally under suspicion and requested she remain confined to her room. The guests reacted with mixed emotions, some relieved, others troubled. The Contessa supported the decision, albeit with cool detachment. Lucille Vale expressed satisfaction, her tone clipped and final. Poirot said nothing. But inwardly, he was certain of one thing. They had followed the wrong trail. It was not an accident. The trail had been laid, like perfume on a handkerchief, designed to attract and distract. The truth, Poirot believed, was not in the passions of the present, but in the calculations of the past. Someone at the Château de Verre was orchestrating a deception of remarkable elegance. And he, Hercule Poirot, had begun to see the threads. Chapter 5. The Mirror's First Crack. The morning air at the Château de Verre carried a brittle chill, despite the sun creeping steadily over the cliffs. It was not the weather, but the atmosphere, a pervasive unease that hung like invisible smoke in the grand halls and Carlem terraces. With Celeste Armandine now confined to her room under suspicion, the balance had shifted. The guests, believing the mystery to be nearly solved, began to behave less like suspects and more like survivors. And yet Poirot, the only man in the estate who smiled that morning, knew the game had only just begun. He was no longer seeking facts. The facts, in their abundance, were already known to him: the timeline, the evidence, the contradictions. Now he sought responses, not in words, but in silences. In flickers of the eyes, in misplaced confidence, in the faint scent of relief that accompanied the belief that danger had passed. It was, to Poirot, the most delicate portion of an investigation, the moment when the guilty believed themselves invisible. He began, as always, not with confrontation, but with conversation. Throughout the day, he walked the grounds, moving from guest to guest, not as an accuser, but as a companion. He asked nothing of the murder. He spoke instead of trivialities, of gardenias, of chess, of the opera season in Vienna. And yet, through these innocuous discussions, he observed how each person reacted to his presence. Sir Hugo Vassal, now emboldened by the narrowing of suspicion, had grown talkative. He spoke of business, of politics, of how unfortunate it was that men of promise like Dominic Vale so often squandered their talent on scandal. Poirot noted how Vassal leaned into these conversations with too much eagerness, as though rehearsing a version of the past he hoped would harden into truth. He was no longer avoiding the subject, he was reshaping it. Lucille Vale remained isolated. She had taken to the library, sitting for long hours in silence beside her brother's abandoned journal. When Poirot passed through the room, he found her motionless, staring at the pages without reading. Her grief had shifted in tone, less expressive, more corrosive. Poirot lingered only a moment, long enough to see that she had begun to underline certain entries. He did not ask which. Dr. Martin, however, intrigued him most. The psychiatrist, who had thus far kept to the periphery of the social current, now moved with a curious energy. He began engaging the others more directly, first in shared meals, then in deliberate conversation. He offered observations, theories even, about the psychology of guilt. He spoke at length, not with the detachment of a clinical mind, but with the performative air of someone casting lines into the water. Poirot understood the technique well. Martin was probing, not for the truth, but for the presence of it in others. He was not merely observing, he was testing. And in doing so, he revealed something more telling than guilt, an eagerness to insert himself into the fabric of the mystery. That afternoon, Poirot arranged a small gathering in the drawing room under the pretense of sharing updates. He made no accusations. Instead, he proposed a question. If one were to orchestrate a murder as an intellectual exercise only, he said with a light smile, what would be the most effective way to mislead an entire room of intelligent observers? The responses were revealing. Vassal offered a theory involving misdirection through motive, suggesting a crime of passion staged to conceal a crime of profit. Lucille Vale proposed that timing was everything, create a moment so dramatic, so emotional, that logic was clouded by sensation. Dr. Martin, smiling as he spoke, posited that the ideal deception was one which encouraged the audience to choose their own false narrative. The best illusions, he said, require no magician. Only an audience willing to be tricked. Poirot said nothing, but he watched, especially Martin. By dusk, the contours of the deception had taken firmer shape in his mind. Poirot walked once more beneath the balcony, studying again the place where Dominique Vale had fallen. Then he moved to the stage beneath the ballroom, a neglected space with heavy curtains and forgotten props. The dust had been disturbed. A crate had been dragged recently, its scrape marks still visible. A narrow rope, used in stage rigging, had been cut. And nearby, on a folding table, he found a small, round compact. Not new. Worn. Its hinge loose. It bore no initials. He did not touch it. He only stood for a long while in that quiet, low-ceilinged space, considering the shape of the truth. Later that evening, Poirot requested a quiet word with the Contessa. They met in her private music salon, a room lined with mirrors and pale silk walls. She looked weary, but composed, still the hostess, still performing. Poirot asked her a single question: who had access to her suite other than herself? She hesitated only slightly before answering. A few trusted servants. Celeste, of course. And once, only once, Dr. Martin, invited to discuss a portrait. Poirot nodded and said nothing more. When he returned to his room, he wrote a single phrase in his notebook: "The manipulation of perception is not proof of intelligence, but it often reveals intent." The next phase, he knew, would be the final narrowing. The guilty party had played their hand with confidence, but not yet certainty. They believed Celeste had been effectively framed. They believed suspicion had settled. But there remained one detail they had not anticipated. Dominique Vale, for all his flaws, had left something behind. Not a clue. Not a confession. But a provocation designed, Poirot now believed, to outwit his killer even in death. The wineglass had not been carried. It had been placed. And it had not been meant for the police. It had been meant for Hercule Poirot. Chapter 6. The Second Shock. It was just past midnight when the chateau stirred once again, this time not to music or whispered scandal, but to a scream that shattered the hush of the sleeping estate. The cry came from the east wing, from the quarters assigned to Dr. Auguste Martin. Within moments, doors flung open and slippered feet echoed across marble. Lights blinked on. Shouts pierced the corridors. And at the heart of the commotion, Poirot arrived, already dressed, already awake. Dr. Martin's room was in disarray. The heavy velvet curtains had been drawn back violently. A chair was overturned. A decanter of cognac lay in shards across the polished floor. But the eye was drawn immediately to the figure crumpled near the hearth. It was the footman, Albin Roux. Unconscious. Bleeding from a deep wound just above the temple. A fireplace poker lay several feet from his open hand. Whether discarded or wrested away was unclear. Lucille Vale stood in the doorway, trembling. "I heard something, a crash," she stammered. "Then that sound, a dull thud. I thought it was a door slamming." Poirot said nothing. He moved to the footman's side, noting the pulse, the sluggish breath, the twitch of fingers. Albin was not dead. But he had come within a hair's breadth of something far worse. The others soon gathered. Sir Hugo, stern and pacing. The Contessa, draped in a silk robe, her expression carved in cold disbelief. And Martin himself, visibly shaken, a cut along his left cheek, shirt askew. "I returned from the balcony," he said, voice flat with shock. "I went to clear my mind. When I came in, he was here. Going through my desk." Poirot turned to look at him. "Did you speak with him?" "No. I startled him. He lunged at me, perhaps in panic. We struggled. I think he slipped." "You think?" Martine's jaw clenched. I didn't mean to hurt him. He fell hard. I don't know why he was here. I barely even know the man. Poirot allowed a long silence to form. Then, as the guests murmured and speculated, Poirot moved quietly across the room and examined the desk. The drawer was indeed ajar. Inside, papers, mostly mundane, medical receipts, appointment books, a sheaf of psychology lectures. But at the bottom, tucked beneath a folder marked Case Studies, Private, there was a leather-bound notebook. Small. Locked. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He stood and turned to Martine. Monsieur, your account is plausible. But it is also convenient. Martine's nostrils flared. Are you accusing me of something? No, no, Poirot said softly. I am simply noting the odds. First, a footman attempts a petty theft, if that is what you claim. Then, by coincidence, he strikes his head in a fall severe enough to nearly kill him. Yet he touched no weapon. There is no sign of robbery, only intrusion. And above all, this occurs mere hours after a young man is murdered under ambiguous circumstances, and his sister, who, I might add, would inherit everything, is now under scrutiny. And yet, here you are, untouched by suspicion. Poirot looked around the room. The silence was heavy. Unless, of course, he added, that is the intention. He made no further accusation. Instead, Poirot requested the room be cleared. Albin Roux was carried to the estate's infirmary. A physician was summoned from the village. The guests returned to their chambers, whispering now with fresh fear. But Poirot remained. He stood alone in the room, eyes fixed not on the broken glass or the wounded servant, but on the desk and the notebook within it. The key, he suspected, had not been used tonight. Albin Roux had not come to steal. He had come to warn. And someone had silenced him. By morning, the mood in the chateau had soured to a brittle silence. Suspicion hung like fog. Meals were sparse and quiet. Eyes flitted with caution, and even the Contessa, long the mistress of elegant detachment, now seemed tense beneath her pearls and veiled hats. Poirot used the quiet to move alone. He went first to the estate kitchens, questioning the kitchen maid who had briefly dated Albin. The girl, no more than 18, said Albin had changed in recent days, become nervous. He said he'd seen something from the servants' corridor behind the ballroom but refused to explain what. He told me not to talk about it, she said. Said it would cause trouble. Then Poirot climbed the narrow servant stair that snaked up to the second floor, to the hidden corridor that ran behind the grand gallery. It was a place of shadows, smelling faintly of dust and polish. A small, finger-smudged window overlooked the glass balcony. From here, a servant could see everything. Unseen. And then he saw it, a small, oily smudge on the wainscoting. Fresh. Like a hand had been pressed there for balance. Poirot knelt and pressed his fingertips gently against the spot. Just beneath it, on the floorboards, was a thin sliver of glass. Not from the wineglass, no. This was different, thicker, curved. It caught the light. It had once belonged to a monocle. Poirot pocketed it carefully. That evening, Poirot took his dinner alone. As the chateau simmered with uncertainty, he wrote 3 letters, one to Inspector Gerard in Nice, one to a legal firm in Paris, and one to a private medical clinic in Lausanne. He sealed each with precision and gave them to the Contessa's driver to be delivered with haste. Then, he waited. For the pieces to realign. For the truth to rise. He knew, now, that the murder of Dominic Vale had not been about rage or inheritance. It had been about silence. About secrecy. Celeste Armandine had been framed too easily. Her story too convenient. Martine's attack too theatrical. Someone was manipulating the scene as a stage, directing the story's flow. But they had failed to predict the most dangerous player of all. The footman had known something, and someone had tried to erase him. Now, Poirot would not be chasing truth. He would be inviting it to walk into the light. Chapter 7. The Hidden Thread. The chateau resumed its stillness, but it was the stillness of tension, not peace. Beneath the clinking of cutlery and the formal pleasantries of high society, there was now an unspoken question: who would be next? Poirot did not announce his intentions. He never did. Instead, he moved as a man absorbed by trivialities, adjusting a misplaced vase in the drawing room, rearranging a misaligned portrait on the landing, pausing far too long before a cabinet of antique figurines. But always watching. Always listening. The guests remained under the same roof, now tethered more by curiosity and dread than by social obligation. Celeste Vale, though not formally accused, was quietly regarded with suspicion. Her silence was no longer mysterious, it had become incriminating. On the second afternoon after the attack on the footman, Poirot took a slow walk around the glass balcony itself. The repair work had been completed hastily, the shattered section of balustrade replaced with clear, modern panels that jarred subtly against the older glass. But Poirot's interest was not in the repair. He examined the surrounding architecture. To one side, the servants' wing, to the other, the private library, where Sir Hugo had spent the hours leading up to Dominic's fall. Below, the gardens sprawled in precise symmetry, manicured paths, trimmed hedges, and stone fountains frozen mid-pour. Poirot stooped low at the corner where the glass had originally shattered. Here, unseen from above, a faint groove marked the wooden frame, too sharp to be natural. It was a scoring mark, thin and exact, as if left by the edge of a tool. Not a spontaneous breakage. A preparation. Poirot's lips pursed. He turned, then descended the marble stairs to the eastern wing, where he requested access to the Contessa's private study. She obliged without hesitation, perhaps mistaking it for deference or favor. Within, her world unfolded in curated luxury, lacquered writing desks, Venetian lamps, silk-bound ledgers, and ivory-lettered correspondence trays. Poirot made no accusations. He inquired only about the recent meetings her foundation had conducted, and whether Dominic Vale had shown interest in any particular charity or donation. The Contessa shook her head, her tone curt. Dominic? No. He thought the whole thing theatrical. He preferred to play the philosopher, not the philanthropist. Poirot glanced briefly at the inkstand on her desk. Black ink. Smooth-bodied, but faintly tinged with rust at the rim. Not from age, no, from iron oxide. A newer ink had been used recently, one prone to smudging. The kind found in cheaper brands, an oddity in so refined a setting. He noted it silently and made his leave. By twilight, Poirot stood once again in the room where Albin Roux now rested, watched over by the estate nurse. The footman remained unconscious, though his breathing had strengthened. A slow recovery, but, for Poirot's purposes, not essential. He had seen what he needed. In the corner of the room, placed among a pile of the boy's personal effects, was a worn leather satchel. Poirot requested it. Inside were ordinary items, gloves, collar stays, a matchbox, but also a small folded paper, torn at the edge. It appeared to be the half of a letter, crumpled and hidden. The handwriting was rushed. Inked in smudgy black. Poirot smoothed it on the table. Can no longer be silent. He knew about the arrangement. I saw the papers myself. She signed it the day before the will was changed. I swear this is not about money. He meant to destroy her. The rest was missing. But Poirot had already begun to see the edges of the pattern. He returned to his quarters, placed the note beside the tiny shard of curved glass recovered from the servants' corridor, and opened a notebook of his own, one no one would see until the time was right. In the margins, he scribbled phrases not yet spoken aloud. Monocle. Curved glass. Optical illusion. Paper trail, why destroy? Martine, Theatrics? Or pressure? Hugo's alibi, who confirmed it? Then, below all else, motivation not in hatred, in fear. That evening, the guests were summoned for a private viewing of a newly arrived piece of art, gifted by the Contessa's auction partner in Vienna, a delicate portrait rendered on glass. It was said to be painted in reverse, a trick of reflection and deception. As they gathered in the gallery, Poirot positioned himself not near the painting, but opposite the window, where the light played strangely across the frame. The portrait appeared different depending on one's vantage. From one angle, it was a smiling woman. From another, she wept. Ironic, is it not? Poirot remarked aloud. The same face, perceived two ways. A matter of glass. And of shadows. The Contessa turned to him, her expression neutral. In art, Monsieur Poirot, perception is everything. But in murder, Poirot replied softly, perception is the first lie. She said nothing. Poirot turned and addressed no one in particular. Glass misleads, yes. But so do words. A will, for example, signed under duress. Or perhaps, rewritten. That pierced the room. Sir Hugo stiffened. Lucille Vale's eyes widened. But Poirot merely folded his hands behind his back and smiled politely. Later that night, a knock came at Poirot's door. It was Lucille. She hesitated, then stepped into the room. Her voice shook, but not from fear. I lied, she said. That night, I wasn't in the music room. I saw Dominic arguing. With Dr. Martin. He accused him of something about the Contessa. I think Dominic found out about an agreement. Some kind of arrangement between them. Poirot nodded slowly. And you said nothing? Because? Because I thought it would ruin everything. And I didn't think Martin would. Her voice trailed off. Poirot guided her gently to a chair. You were afraid of the scandal, he said. And yet you are brave now. Why? She looked up, blinking tears. Because I think someone else will die if I don't say it. Poirot's eyes softened. But his voice remained precise. Then you must trust me. Tomorrow, mademoiselle, I will call everyone together. No more silence. The deception, it has begun to fray. Section 8. Trace beneath the glass. The sun never quite pierced the clouds that morning, casting the chateau in a silver half-light, fitting, perhaps, for what was to come. A subdued breakfast was served in the east salon, where clinks of porcelain masked the glances exchanged across tables. Each guest sensed the air tightening, as if fate itself hovered just beyond the doorway, waiting for one final act. At precisely 10 o'clock, Hercule Poirot made his request known. Every guest, every staff member directly tied to the events of the past week, was to gather in the glass gallery, a long, sun-drenched room lined with crystal vases and mirrors, once built to reflect the wealth and transparency of the Montressoir legacy. Today, it would serve a different purpose. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle. At the head stood Poirot, motionless, hands clasped before him. No uniformed constable, no dramatic pronouncement. Just the stillness of expectation. When the last guest arrived, the Contessa herself, dressed in mourning black, Poirot began. Mesdames et messieurs, he said gently, we have spoken enough in fragments. Now we must speak in truths. No one moved. He took a slow step forward, his gaze falling on each face in turn. Dominic Vale was not pushed in haste. He was selected. Isolated. Lured. His fall from the glass balcony was a calculated attempt on his life, and the person who orchestrated it knew precisely how to conceal the act behind broken glass and panic. Lucille Vale paled, her hands clenched in her lap. Poirot continued. But then came the second blow. Albin Roux. A loyal footman who, unbeknownst to his attacker, had seen too much. The Contessa spoke, her voice low. Do you mean to say the same person tried to silence him? Poirot turned to her. I do not believe so. And that is what makes this case delicately layered. You see, mademoiselle, the attack on Monsieur Roux was not a continuation, but a complication. Gasps stirred among the group. Poirot raised a finger. There were 2 crimes. And 2 culprits. He allowed the statement to settle before he moved again, this time toward the large mirror behind the gallery's central sculpture. Let us examine motive, not in the crude sense of gain, but in the deeper realm of fear and preservation. His eyes flicked toward Dr. Martin. Monsieur had reason to be afraid. Not of money, but of exposure. Martin stiffened. Dominic Vale confronted you 3 days before his fall, Poirot said calmly. He discovered your prior association with the Contessa in Vienna. An arrangement, not criminal, perhaps, but damaging. You invested in one of her art charities, but the funding was unofficial. Your name appeared nowhere. A concealed patron. Why? Martin's lips were tight. He said nothing. Poirot did not press. Dominic threatened to reveal this arrangement. He believed the Contessa was manipulating philanthropic donations to influence future inheritance. A modern, elegant blackmail, non? And so, he had to be stopped. He pointed gently toward the edge of the balcony, just visible beyond the glass doors. You prepared the glass pane days in advance. Scored it with a diamond stylus, making it vulnerable at a precise pressure point. And when the time came, you lured Dominic onto that very section. The guest stared, stunned. But you did not plan for one thing, Poirot continued. Albin Roux. He had taken a shortcut through the southern corridor and saw you arrive on the balcony alone just before the pane shattered. He said nothing, perhaps unsure what he had seen. But he kept a note of it. A half-written confession. One I found in his satchel. Poirot turned to Martin. You attacked Albin later that night. A blow to the back of the head. Desperate. Crude. But not lethal. Martin inhaled sharply, then spoke at last. I never meant to kill him. I only needed the note. The fool wouldn't listen. Poirot inclined his head gently. Ah. Merci, monsieur. Your honesty comes late, but it comes. Then Poirot turned. And now we come to the second layer. The deeper thread. He faced Sir Hugo Montressoir. Sir Hugo, you were curiously quick to defend Dr. Martin's alibi. You claimed he was in the library with you during the time of Dominic's fall. But that was a lie, was it not? Hugo's mouth opened, then closed again. You lied, Poirot continued, because you had a greater fear. Not of Dr. Martin's guilt, but of your own exposure. Poirot's voice grew quieter. You recently amended your will. You changed your heirs. Dominic was to be removed entirely, and your estate funneled through a trust managed by the Contessa's foundation. She knew this. Dominic suspected it. Sir Hugo's voice cracked. He said he'd contest it. That it was manipulation. But I was trying to. Poirot raised a hand. You were trying to make amends. But too late. And when Dominic confronted the Contessa, you believed she had orchestrated the whole thing. You feared she had used her influence to trap you in legal bindings. His voice became sharper. So you tried to retrieve the original papers. Quietly. You broke into her study that evening. Your fingerprint was found on the inside lid of her ink drawer. A drawer you claimed never to have opened. The Contessa's face was unreadable. Poirot nodded slowly. You saw the letters. You panicked. And when Albin approached you, perhaps to speak of what he'd seen on the balcony, you assumed he knew more. You struck him. That blow was yours. Silence consumed the room. Poirot straightened. So you see. 2 crimes. Two hands, both born of fear. One feared scandal, the other betrayal. No one spoke. The mirrors around them reflected frozen expressions: shame, disbelief, sorrow. Poirot closed his notebook. I have spoken with the authorities. They are on their way. Sir Hugo bowed his head. Martine, eyes closed, whispered something inaudible. The Contessa rose, her voice calm. You've destroyed everything. Poirot met her gaze with quiet finality. No, madam. You merely mistook glass for armor. But in the end, it reflects. Chapter 9, Justice by Reflection. The glass gallery slowly emptied, yet its silence lingered like perfume on fine silk, subtle, but impossible to ignore. Chairs scraped gently against the floor as the guests departed one by one, no longer as lords or ladies, but as witnesses to an unraveling. What remained was not the grandeur of the chateau, but the fragile residue of human frailty, exposed in the crystalline morning light. Outside, a police motorcar rolled up the long gravel drive, its wheels cracking the quiet like a prelude to resolution. Two officers stepped out, one carrying a satchel of paperwork, the other with a look of reluctant awe. Few had ever been summoned to the Montressoir estate, and fewer still to arrest its patriarch. Poirot stood waiting just beyond the vestibule, his hands folded neatly behind his back. There was no triumph in his stance, no satisfaction. Only the calm of a man who had seen too much of human weakness to be surprised by it. Dr. Martin was the first to step forward. He did not struggle, nor did he beg. He merely nodded as the cuffs were fastened, his gaze turned toward the sprawling lawns beyond the windows, as if searching for a horizon that no longer existed. Sir Hugo Montressoir took longer. He rose slowly, as if lifting the weight of his entire legacy, and placed his walking cane gently on the table beside him. There were no words. Only the quiet clack of his shoes across the marble floor as he joined the officers at the door. The Contessa watched it all in silence. Though untouched by the law, her reputation was now as transparent, and as shattered, as the glass balcony itself. Poirot remained behind, declining the offer to return to Paris immediately. He chose instead to walk the grounds once more, through the terraced gardens and vine-shrouded paths that had seemed, only days before, part of a pastoral painting. Now, they belonged to reality. A harsher one. At the edge of the estate, he paused beneath the balcony where Dominic Vale had fallen to his death. The repair crew had yet to arrive, and the jagged remnants of the glass still glittered faintly in the morning sun like fallen stars. He looked upward, hands folded before him. No one joined him. He did not speak. Later, in the drawing room where fresh tea had been laid, Poirot allowed himself a moment of rest. The windows were open, and the breeze carried the faint sound of distant hoofbeats, perhaps a guest departing for good. Or perhaps only the wind chasing memories through corridors too old to care. Miss Lucille Vale entered, alone. She approached without hesitation and sat opposite Poirot, her posture reserved but composed. "I suppose I should thank you," she said softly. Poirot did not smile. He only nodded. "I had believed in redemption," she continued. "I thought Dominic would be the one to lift us out of the shadows. Instead, he became a shadow himself." Poirot responded gently. "Sometimes, mademoiselle, it is not about lifting out of the shadow, but learning to walk within it without letting it change one's heart." She gave a faint, sad smile. "He said once that truth was like a glass of wine. It could bring warmth or shatter a night." "Ah," Poirot said, touching his fingertips together, "and like glass, truth reflects. Always." She stood after a moment and placed a small envelope on the table. "He wrote this the morning before he died. I think it's meant for you." Poirot waited until she had gone, then opened the envelope with care. The note was short. Ink faded slightly from where it had been folded. "If anything should happen to me, It won't be because I couldn't speak. It will be because I spoke too late. Trust behavior, not appearances. And never assume glass cannot break. Poirot folded the letter and slid it into his coat pocket. By evening, the chateau had quieted to an almost eerie degree. The dinner bell rang, but fewer than half a dozen plates were set. The staff whispered more now, not with gossip, but with uncertainty. The security of old money had cracked, revealing that beneath it, the same hungers, fears, and jealousies churned as in any place. Poirot declined dinner and instead took a seat by the fire in the study. He allowed the flames to flicker across his polished shoes as he considered what had passed. Not merely the logic of it all, though that, of course, had its order, but the psychology. Sir Hugo, despite his honor, had let fear override his dignity. Dr. Martin, for all his intellect, had fallen into desperation. Even Albin Roux, brave and silent, had miscalculated the weight of truth. They had each played a part in a symphony of silence, hoping their own notes would be drowned out. Yet it was not the most obvious lie, nor the loudest cry, that had betrayed them. It had been the inconsistencies, the subtle gaps, the twitch of a hand, the timing of a glance, the way one man had spoken too quickly and another not at all. In the end, it was always the human element that revealed the truth, not the evidence, not the scene, but the soul. He reached for his pocket watch, snapped it open, and nodded. Midnight. Time to return. Chapter 10. Order restored. The morning mist clung to the lawns like a veil not yet lifted, softening the hard lines of the chateau's grandeur. From the window of his guest suite, Poirot watched the grounds stir to life, footmen polishing brass lanterns, a maid shaking out fine linen, the butler directing the movement of trunks. It was a return to routine, but nothing would ever quite be the same. He took his time dressing, as he always did. Every button aligned, every crease sharp, his tie knotted with symmetrical care. It was not vanity. It was control. Order. A kind of peace that the world, in its reckless chaos, so rarely afforded. A knock came at the door. It was Inspector Bellamy, his expression sheepish. Monsieur Poirot. The constable said you hadn't left yet. May I? Poirot gestured toward the armchair near the hearth. Of course, mon ami. Bellamy sat, hat in hand, twisting the brim like a man uncertain whether to speak or apologize. The papers are calling it a scandal of the century. The Montressoirs, the doctor, the forged wills. You've turned high society upside down. Poirot did not look away from the window. Society, monsieur, is like a chandelier. Glittering, delicate, and far too easy to fracture if its foundation is not sound. Bellamy shifted in his chair. Still, we had the wrong man twice. I'm grateful you were here. Poirot turned now, eyes calm and sharp. It is not shameful to be misled. Only to remain misled. Bellamy gave a quiet nod. Is there anything else I should know for the report? Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. The matter is finished. Dominic Vale's death was no crime of passion. It was a decision, calculated, desperate. The kind that men make when they fear the past catching up faster than the future can forgive. And the others? Bellamy asked. The Contessa? Albin Roux. The Contessa has lost the only currency she truly valued, reputation. And Monsieur Roux, Poirot said, will carry the burden of having known and done nothing. That is justice, too, though of a quieter kind. Bellamy stood, nodding once more. Safe travels, Poirot. Poirot inclined his head. And may you always listen to what is not said, Inspector. Often, it speaks the loudest. Left alone, Poirot made one final inspection of the room. His suitcase was packed precisely. A single pressed handkerchief was folded atop his coat. On the table, beside a vase of lilies that had begun to fade, lay a small envelope, his last correspondence at the chateau. It had been placed there by Miss Lucille Vale before her departure that morning. He picked it up gently, opening it with care. You did not just reveal the truth. You preserved something that might have been lost forever. Merci. There was no signature. None was needed. Poirot descended the grand staircase for the final time. Below, the staff parted quietly as he passed, a silent corridor of nods and murmurs. The Countess, though not arrested, had already vanished from the estate, retreating to Paris under a cloak of discretion and damage control. In the drawing-room, Sir Hugo's portrait hung askew. A maid attempted to straighten it, but Poirot stopped her with a gentle wave. "Leave it," he said. "It is instructive." Out in the courtyard, the car awaited him. A black Citroën, polished to a mirror sheen, the driver already in his seat. Poirot paused before stepping in and turned back once to look at the chateau. The sun was now high enough to strike the upper floors, illuminating the famed glass balcony. New panes had been installed, unblemished, gleaming. But Poirot did not see restoration. He saw illusion. For what had happened there could not be replaced, nor truly forgotten. And perhaps, he thought, it should not be. As the car pulled away, winding through the chestnut-lined road toward the gates, Poirot leaned back in his seat, fingertips steepled against one another. There had been lies, yes, layers of them. Lies dressed as loyalty. Lies veiled in grief. But beneath them all, the truth had remained constant, waiting only for the proper angle of reflection. He had found it in a clumsily placed alibi, in the nervous twitch of a left eye, in the poetic irony of a man who trusted glass to protect him from the consequences of deceit. And that, Poirot reflected, was the true tragedy, not the fall, not even the murder, but the illusion that those who deceive themselves are safe from the consequences of deceiving others. The car passed through the chateau gates, and the road opened onto the wide expanse of the French countryside. Fields shimmered in gold and green, dotted with the shadow of distant crows, and in the far distance, the towers of Paris awaited. Poirot reached for his pocket watch. The time was precisely 10:02 a.m. And with a soft smile, he whispered into the quiet. "Justice, she may arrive late, but she does not forget her way." And so, the mystery draws to a close. The truths have been unearthed, the masks have fallen, and justice, as it always does when Monsieur Poirot is near, has found its way through the fog. Thank you, wherever you are in the world, for walking with me through each twist and turn. I hope this tale brought you as much intrigue and suspense as it brought me joy in sharing it with you. If you enjoyed this journey, be sure to subscribe for more mysteries waiting in the wings. And don't be shy, leave a comment and tell me, did you solve it before Poirot did? Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and beware the quietest of suspects. Goodbye.